this day. Thank you for your blessings, God. And we pray that you'll just help us now in this class. We just honor you and we praise your holy name right now in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. All right. So we are doing live stream just to kind of help one of the students out, but also just to kind of give people an idea of what we do in the Gospel of John. All right. So we read through, what is today, Monday? We read through on Friday, John 18. Yes, ma'am.
I just sent you a friend request.
Okay.
What do you want me to say?
He just sent me a friend request. Can you do it on mine? That's all right.
Let's get your secretary to help you.
Yeah. I don't have it at the app. I just go through Chrome. All right. So, because I'm old, I was like,
where's your Facebook?
Yeah, I don't have the app. Yeah. Okay.
You just go to the YouTube channel.
Either that, whatever you want. All right. So we read through 18 on Friday, and I wanted to make sure that we pulled out a couple of things about some of the things in chapter 18. Then we'll move into chapter 19 real quickly. I won't spend a whole lot of time here. But one of the things that I wanted you to pick up on, 4 features about Christ during his arrest. And I also have on here where we traced last time, where we traced going through where he was at his trial. But before we get to the trial, this is the arrest. This is when Judas and those come and arrest him. And there are 4 things that are interesting, beautiful to notice really about Jesus when they arrest him, they come to arrest him. Number 1 is his astonishing composure. And we're not going to read 18 because we've already read 18. We read that last, we read it Friday. So his astonishing composure. Jesus did not run away. He didn't leave. He approaches the officers. He took initiative and approached the officers. Again, he knew what was going to happen. He knew the things that were going to happen to him. He doesn't run from the will of God. He stands and he faces the will of God and all the difficulties that are about to partake. Secondly is his moral authority, and that is, and this is powerful. Remember, we read this in chapter 18, where when Jesus says, using the phrase ego eimi, I am he, I am the Christ here, that the soldiers fall down to the ground. In other words, this is again a response of his glory, of the fact that he is God, the fact that he is the Alpha and the Omega, if you will. I love what Calvin says here. Calvin says that this is a foreshadowing of the sword of his mouth that will, talking about Christ, the sword of his mouth that will come on the day of judgment. In other words, there is coming a day in which Christ is going to return, not as a babe in Bethlehem, not as the one who's dripping blood with a crown of thorns and all this kind of other stuff, but he's coming back on the day of judgment, and he is going to declare to the world, I am he. And just like the soldiers falling to the ground, many who do not know Christ, in fact, the Bible actually says that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So everyone will bow to the great I am. It just depends on whether you are on this side of that. In other words, if you're saved, going into that situation, or not saved. So not only is it his astonishing composure and his moral authority, but also his concern for others. And we see this in the way he cares for his disciples. He desires that he's the one they're looking for, let the others go, that he alone is to be taken. And of course, he shows his concern for his disciples, that Christ desires that he alone is to be taken. He shows himself as the good shepherd who takes care of his sheep. And then finally is, once again, probably tying in with the first one, his submission to God. We see this in verses 10 and 11. The submission to God, that no one takes the life of Christ. No one takes his life, but that he willingly submits himself to the will of God. And this has been a consistent theme throughout the Gospel of John. They try to make him king, but his what? Hour had not yet come. They tried to kill him and stone him, but his hour had not yet come. It was not the time to submit. It was not the time for him to be stoned like a sinner at that point in time. No, he's now submitting himself, as he's always been, submitting himself to the will of God. And again, he offers no resistance. In fact, he rebukes Peter, because what does Peter do? We read this in John chapter 18. Before the denial, what is Peter? This is the arrest. Yeah, he tried. It doesn't try. Actually, he actually succeeds. Right? He cuts the ear of Malchus, is the name of the guy. Cuts the ear of Malchus off. You know, if I were a little bit mischievous, if I were Jesus and I were a little bit mischievous, and we know that Jesus is not, but I think I would have put the ear on maybe upside down or something like that. Just knowing me, okay? But Jesus is, thank goodness I'm not he and he's not me, right? But Jesus, even in that scene, and we don't see that actually in the Gospel of John, but Jesus actually in the other Gospels, he will pick up the ear and put it back on the man. So again, he doesn't resist, he doesn't fight, but he submits to God, okay? Everyone have this. Good. All right, now, here we go with the procession of the trial and the things. All this is done in the middle of the night. Of course, this is John 18, 12 through 27. First of all, after the arrest, Jesus is led. I should put blanks there. That way you could have filled this out because we've all read this. But I'm too nice. All right, so after the arrest, Jesus is first led away to Annas. Remember, Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the former high priest. There even could possibly be some overlapping in their reign, which is why he is led away to Annas first. It is while he is at Annas that Jesus is struck after he's hit, after answering a question concerning his disciples and his doctrine. It's the way in which he being disrespectful to Annas. They strike him, they hit him. Annas then sends Jesus bound to Caiaphas. And again, please note that all of this, Jesus was arrested late in the evening, and then all of this takes place in the middle of the night till we get to 6 a.m. in the morning by the time he reaches Pilate. But here Annas sends Jesus bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And on the journey, it is here that on the journey to Caiaphas, somewhere in this journey, Peter is interrogated. I say interrogated. He's asked the question 3 times, right? He feels like he's interrogated. Conviction has gotten a hold of him, and he feels that he's interrogated. But all he's been really doing is people have been just asking him, are you the one that's been with Christ? Oh, you sound like the one who's been with Christ, right? Regardless of however Peter interprets it or we interpret it, he just denies 3 times. The rooster crows, and again proving the prophecy of Jesus, what Jesus said, as far as by the time the rooster crows, then you will deny me. All of this is now early in the morning. We now move early in the morning. It's around 6 a.m. when Jesus is sent to Pilate. the Roman governor of Jerusalem. And I'll get to him in just a moment. I actually have a slide for him. But the Roman governor of Jerusalem. Pilate's, the dialogue here, and actually this spills on into chapter 19 just a little bit. But the primary questions concerning Jesus' kingship. In other words, is Jesus a king, or is he the king of the Jews? And Pilate, of course, is concerned about this because Caesar doesn't need a rival. That's the problem there, is that they already have a king. That's Caesar, and they will. This whole little dialogue again will open up as well. Jesus obviously says in chapter 18, my kingdom is not of this world. What does he say? If my kingdom were of this world, then my people would fight for me. They would fight against those. But he is talking about a heavenly kingdom, a greater kingdom. Jesus has come to bear witness of the truth. Interestingly enough, when I was reading this phrase, who else came to bear witness of the truth prior to Jesus? Who? Earthly guy prior to Jesus. John the Baptist. Remember John the Baptist?
John.
Oh, did you say John? I thought you said God.
You didn't think I was stupid. I said John.
Okay, well maybe it's the congestion blocking you up. You sound like you said God.
It did sound like God.
Thank you,
I heard
Abigail.
John.
Thank
I
you.
heard thank you. I
Okay.
said John. I thought I was stupid.
No, yes, it is John the Baptist. Okay, my apologies. Your snot got in the way.
Thank you.
All right, so yes, John the Baptist came to bear witness of the truth. Jesus comes to bear witness of himself as the truth. Pilate asked the most philosophical question that could ever be asked: what is truth? And we kind of dealt with a little bit of that on Friday, as far as him asking about what is truth and him not knowing really what that truth was as he's staring it in the face as far as Christ is concerned. And then he comes out and he tells the Jews, I find no fault in him. And when Pilate says, I find no fault in him, that would almost try to paint Pilate as a sympathetic figure. But he is not a sympathetic figure. He's basically a coward who doesn't really try to understand who the Jews are. Everyone have this almost? He's not, and you get this a lot of times from these crazy rulers, right? You know, Nebuchadnezzar trying to look and see if the boys in the fire were okay. He's not sympathetic about it. He's just, he's concerned for his own personal reasons. Even with the king of Persia releasing Israel in, you have these rulers who seem sympathetic. And sometimes they are bent that way by the grace of God, but they're not, they really are bad people. And Pilate was one of these people as well. In fact, Pilate was basically a washed up soldier. He was a military man. He was a washed up soldier. In his later years, you may not know the reference, but he had a Saddam Hussein or a Nebuchadnezzar complex. He would actually send troops out to battle to die for no reason. He was mentally unstable. In fact, Rome pulled him from leading the troops to now becoming a Roman procurator. And yes, procurator is English. But please notice the in bold here that procurator means governor. So you may be asked that on the test, all right? So he becomes a Roman procurator. And the way you became that was by muscle or by strength. In other words, you were deemed fit for the job. And here Rome has put somebody who's mentally unstable, not really fit for the job. Procurators were absentee landlords. They did not live in the region that they governed. Like, for instance, Pilate did not live in Jerusalem. He actually lived in Caesarea. Caesarea was kind of like the Roman resort town. And Pilate knew nothing about and cared nothing for the Jewish background or the Jewish people. He hated the Jews and vice versa. They hated him. In fact, when it gets down to releasing just his desire, I find no fault in Jesus. Again, he's not painting a sympathetic picture here. He's really wanting to release Jesus to tick the Jews off. The Jews want him crucified. Pilate says, "Yeah, not really. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to just release Jesus and just irritate these people." And again, this part of the story you see kind of in chapter 19 as well, because here's the thing. They accuse him, and the Jews accuse him and say, if you let this man go, if you let Jesus go, you are not a quote-unquote friend of Caesar. And a friend of Caesar was a title, not that you were buddy pals with Caesar, but that you were in some kind of right understanding relationship, political relationship with Caesar. And this was the threat that was given by the Jews. If you don't crucify Jesus the way we want you to crucify Jesus, we will report you to Caesar, and you're already on thin ice enough with him as it is. He'll probably have you killed because you can't keep peace in Jerusalem. And of course, by the end of chapter 18, the crowd, remember, is crying out, crucify him, and he wants to release somebody. He says, by your custom, we can release one person, and instead of releasing Jesus, they release Barabbas.
That's weird.
Can you imagine? And not even, but Barabbas himself, probably not knowing what's happened, but he probably, as they were passing by, Jesus is going back to be crucified, Barabbas is being released, and he's literally looking at the man who paid for his redemption. And he probably is ignorant of it. He probably doesn't know anything about it, right? All he knows is he's being set free, because remember, Barabbas was a robber, right? So he's literally looking at the man who literally pays for his redemption. The one guy who actually is right there, maybe other than the guy on the cross, but the one guy that's right there whom Jesus actually died for, who's going to die for right there in the flesh. And Barabbas is no acknowledgement. All right, if you will, somebody pick up in chapter 19. And I tell you what, since we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this particular subject, just read verse 1.
John.
Yes, we are in John.
John 19:1.
John 19, chapter 1.
To Jesus and flogged him.
One more time, I think your mucus got in the way.
Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him.
Yes. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. King James will say scourged or flogged. So we're going to spend some time now talking about this subject. The mastiago is the actual, the action, if you will. I'm sorry.
What does scourge mean?
Scourge means flogged. In other words, and I'm about to describe that entire process.
What's flogged?
Hold on. I'm going. That's the whole point of the lecture. I'm going to describe the entire process. There is more. All right. The word mastiago is Latin for to whip or to beat with a lash. That should kind of give you an idea of what flogging is, right?
Not like the whip and nay. It's not that.
It's not. No, it's not anything like a whip and nay. Okay.
Okay, no whip and nay.
All right. So related to this word myomai, which means to go over something. So here's the act. Just from this one word here is describing the action of not just you're going to beat somebody one time with a whip, but you're going to go over and over and over them with this whip. Vibratio is the Roman word, which is the actual describing the concept, if you will. It describes the concept. It is always accompanied with a capital. In other words, if you had a capital sentence, like they were going to put you to death, they're going to beat you first before they put you to death.
Why can't they just put us to death?
It's a form of punishment. And remember, capital sentences wasn't just about putting people to death either. I mean, but they were going to beat you with this whip, okay? It came with other degrading punishments, such as the loss of freedom or civil rights. In many cases, I can't even pronounce this morning, the vibratio itself was fatal. And if you've ever watched The Passion of the Christ, which is probably the closest thing that you could describe to visually seeing what it looked like for someone to be whipped and beaten with one of these things, it was a little more than rough. In fact, I would almost argue that it might be worse with the beating that Jesus took than the whips of old American slave days. I mean, and I'm not trying to minimize those. I'm just saying there was a different kind of whip that they used in old American slave days than what we are describing here. And this, and I'll show you a picture of it in just a moment, this is just very difficult. It usually, again, and by the way, don't get the idea that the Romans invented crucifixion. Crucifixion was actually probably even earlier than the Greeks. The Romans, however, improved crucifixion so that you suffered longer upon the cross. Basically, crucifixion was basically they ran you through from bottom to top with a pole.
That's just
what?
They impaled you from
like
bottom to top.
Impaled as in hit you.
No. They took a pole and they shoved it
Up your rear and it came out your top.
Yeah, and you were impaled on this pole.
That's just nasty. I can't even imagine
The-
how that works.
The Greeks,
Oh
the Greeks were doing this long before the Romans were
They
doing
stick it in
it.
Yeah.
Yes.
through your butt,
Yeah. We
And
are
then
on
you're
live stream.
straight
and then it
Yes.
comes through your mouth.
No.
Well, no,
Straight in
sometimes
the
it comes
head.
out of your head.
Oh my gosh.
And you know, even in older pagan cultures, they would just chop off your head and impale you just the head on the.
See, that seems nicer.
Well, at least you were dead by then, right?
Oh,
You know,
yeah,
that
I
kind
guess.
of thing. So, but yeah, the impaling. But and we'll actually talk about the cross and the crucifixion process and all that kind of other stuff Wednesday. Here we're just talking about the beating. So let's continue on. Everybody have this
Yeah,
part?
let's continue.
All right, so, and I'll cut the line off just for a moment here. Hopefully this is what is the
Can we write that
flagellum,
down?
please? Would you?
Yeah, we will.
Now, notice something about the whip, and I have this on notes too, so you can you can get the notes in just a moment. Notice something about this whip, and this is what I mean by how this whip is different from the one you would see, like just a Indiana Jones whip or you know, the old whips that they would use in old American slave days. Okay, this particular whip was not necessarily a whip itself; it was what they actually called the cat of nine tails. The reason they called it the cat of nine tails is because they had 9 leather straps to it. And notice the metal. The endings were made of metal and bone and all kinds of other stuff, so that when it ripped into, I mean, it did more damage than this. So when it ripped into your flesh, it literally, and again, if you've seen The Passion of Christ, it literally pulled chunks of flesh.
That's it, because they got him.
Yeah.
When I was watching, they got him on the side, and then it would move, so he yanked it towards.
Yes.
So it would,
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, and let's go ahead to that slide because I have not the picture. First of all, it was so this process. Remember, this is prior to the crucifixion. Prior to the crucifixion, this process is so bad and so brutal that an emperor by the name of Domitian, this is the emperor who would reign under John over John, while he writes the book of Revelation. And he will talk about Domitian a little bit in metaphorical language. But Domitian was horrified by it. This kind of, and we're encouraged here today, we're all ladies, that women were exempted from this punishment. Some secular commentaries may provide more detail, but the estimate was 40 stripes was all a man could survive. No, it was 39. Well, I know Paul says that he was also beaten 39 stripes as well. So the estimate is that he was beaten about 40 times. So with 9 whips, or the 9 tails on the whip.
I tell you what, watching that part, those people who actually did the whipping, they were sadistic.
Well, yeah, you kind of have to be a little sadistic to take something that has bone and metal and everything. Others said there was no prescribed number. You just kept beating. And again, here's the part here. You kept beating until flesh hung down in bloody shreds, which is, again, probably what you saw also on the Passion of Christ, is that basically there was actual flesh and muscle and everything exposed on Jesus's body as he was being whipped.
I think we should watch that.
Sometimes I do. Leslie's already beating us to it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do show the video, of him, being beaten and everything like that.
We should bring God's kids.
But I don't know that I can personally handle it either. It's somewhat easier to talk about than it is to actually watch.
It makes us really, it puts it in perspective.
I may do that. I may open up next class and show
No.
some of the video.
We should
Not the
watch-
whole movie.
We should watch the clip where
where he's
right
being
now.
beat, yeah. Well, how about save it if you
Don't
haven't
watch
seen it?
it.
Don't watch it then.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the scourging, other than typical Roman sentencing, is that perhaps some scholars think that the aim of Pilate was to awaken pity among the Jews. And again, he's not trying to be kind to the Jews, and he's not really trying to be kind to Jesus. What he's basically saying, he really wants to let Jesus go. And so he has him scourged basically to say, all right, beat him nearly half to death. Is this enough? And of course, it's for the bloodthirsty Pharisees and Jews, this is not enough. They want him crucified. And again, he wants to only impose scourging without crucifixion. He really wants to let him go. And again, it has nothing to do with compassion. Do you remember, and this is specific to the Gospel of John, after they beat him nearly half to death, what then happens? And this is not, crucifixion is not next. What's next?
They can carry the cross.
Before the cross, before he even touches the cross.
Carries it?
Okay.
What?
I think if we read our text, it might help
Where are
us.
we going? Where are we going?
All right, so somebody other than Ashley, somebody who has clear sinus passageways, please read from verse 2.
To 4?
No, let's go ahead and read to verse 16. That way it will. Yeah.
Oh,
Who wants to
the
read?
crowd.
Okay,
I'm
let
sorry.
somebody else read who has clear passageways.
I want to read like 2 to 10, and then someone can pick it up.
All right, do that.
And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arranged him in a purple robe.
they came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer.
Can you read one more verse? That'll end the paragraph.
So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me. Do you know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it has been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin."
Okay, now Abigail, will you pick it up and finish from 12 to 16, please?
From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew,
Gabbatha.
Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Jesus away.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so the next thing, of course, that they do after the beating is that they twist a crown of thorns upon him. This crown of thorns is not your typical Easter props that you have in an Easter drama, okay? This crown of thorns were vines with 12-inch spikes, long spikes that they pushed down into his skull. This is, again, reminding you after beating him half to death. They're shoved into his temple, yes.
So in the movie, there's this ugly big baby, and actually that's
It's
Satan.
Satan carrying the baby.
That's an interpretation.
But it's not in the Bible.
No, that is an
That thing
interpretation
is ugly.
of Mel Gibson's.
So that's
He
not.
took a little bit of over creativity
Okay,
there.
okay, I thought it was.
Yeah. I don't really know what it's supposed to symbolize other than Satan or whatever. I'm not sure. Yeah, something like that. I'm not quite sure. You do realize that Mel Gibson is Catholic. And so it comes from, even though Passion of the Christ is good, and if anybody knows how to do a bloody, gory scene, it's Mel Gibson. Yeah, he's Catholic, and so he's telling the story. There are little Roman Catholic nuances in it. Same thing, by the way, as The Chosen. But anyway, and then there is in verse 2 the color of royalty, which is the purple robe. They mocked him by proclaiming him as king. Each one took turns. These soldiers took turns slapping Jesus. The whole idea was to make Jesus not look like a king, but rather a court jester, foolish man. Well, I didn't know if everybody knew what a jester was, so yes, a foolish man, a fool. They dressed. He claimed he was a king, so they put a crown of thorns on him, and they dressed him up like a king to mock him and to make him look foolish. Get into some interesting philosophical thoughts here for a moment. Pilate says, "Behold the man." The question is of Jesus's deity. Remember, they say we must kill him because why? He made himself as the Son of God. And the crowd's response is crucify him. And Pilate's response is, who in the world are you that these people want to kill you so desperately? In fact, that's what he says when they lead him to the praetorium, or the pavement, the judgment seat, if you will. He said to Jesus, where are you from? In other words, why are you in so much trouble? Of course, Jesus says that Pilate has no real power unless it is given from God. But then he says something even more interesting that I want us to have a slight discussion on, if we can or not, hopefully. Look at verse 11. Verse 11, you could have no power against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Has the greater sin. So, there's a question. Can you have one sin that is greater over another sin? There is an argument that says that sin is sin is sin, and it doesn't matter what the degree of sin is. And then there is this phrase that one who has a greater sin. And this is from R.C. Sproul. He's passed away now, right before COVID hit. So he got a chance to miss all that mess. But he brings out what is called the doctrine of concurrence. The doctrine of concurrence. And the doctrine of concurrence basically means that God works in and through the evil actions of sinful men to accomplish his purpose. And this should not be something strange. I just talked a little while ago about Nebuchadnezzar. I talked a little while ago about the Persian king, either Cyrus or Darius or Artaxerxes. Those were evil people whom God used even in their sinful actions and to accomplish his divine purpose. Who related to this story? To the story of Christ and his arrest and his trial, could we relate to this idea of God using evil people to accomplish his purpose? Well, there's several people. Pilate would be one of them. But then also you have Caiaphas, Annas. How about Judas? How about Judas Iscariot? And how God used it. What do you think about this? What is this?
How you for part place.
Yes.
When God used them. I've always started with Judas because he spent so long, and I always wondered why all that time there, and he never changed his mind about betraying him. And I just don't get that concept. I mean, he spent time with the Son of God.
Yeah.
And the betrayal, it was just always he
saw the miracles, right? He saw Jesus turn water into wine. He saw him walk on water. He was in the boat, all that kind of other stuff. He saw the feeding of the 5,000 and everything else. How could this have been in his mind and in his heart the whole time? And that's kind of the way it's depicted, is that it was always in the purpose of God to use Judas as the one. I mean, again, we say this, somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody had to play the role. And I hate to use that phrase, but that's almost the way you see it. Somebody had to play the role of betraying Jesus. In other words, how do you get Jesus from being loved by everybody to getting him to the cross? Somebody had to play the role of betraying Jesus. and it was Judas. And it really is, and Paul will even talk about this later, how God does, and I know this is difficult for some people, but how he does prepare some for glory, but even some to destruction, some to fulfill purposes. Again, think about Pharaoh. Pharaoh is used for God's glory, because his heart is so hardened against God's people and against God that he refuses until his own firstborn son is killed. Right? Yeah.
So maybe I'm lost in this one. Isn't that kind of like not the free will part kind of thing? Because we all have the choice to do things with the free will.
The problem is when we talk about free will, when you don't know Christ or you don't know God, your will is already born to what kind of disposition? In other words, your will is already born to a sinful disposition. You were born. In other words, when we talk about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, it wasn't a big hop, skip, and a jump. It wasn't a big leap for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, because Pharaoh was already a sinner. He thought that he was a God himself, right? He's a sinner. It doesn't take much to push a sinner over the edge. It doesn't take much to do that, right? Because we're already born in sin. We're already born with that bent. People argue the issue is not about free will. The problem is our will is already bent. This is what we talk about total depravity. Our will is already bent to sin. It must be bent back by the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. But our will, if God left every one of us in our sin, he would be righteous and fair and just. He does not have to save us. If he killed every single one of us because of our sin, he would be right and fair and just in doing so.
That's why it's so confusing, because you just understand that with Pharaoh, because he was already a wicked man and stuff like that. And I know that we're all deep down wicked.
Because if you're going where I think you're going, how could God pronounce that over somebody who's innocent?
Well, no, it's just like Jesus called Judas to join them.
Yes.
So it's just, he could have had a chance, but I don't know.
Anyone else want to join in the conversation?
Stop letting me talk.
No, I'm letting you. I'm just kind of, because I've heard this argument over and over and over again. Of the anticipation of, does Judas have a chance to come out? And some people want to argue, yes, that he does have this chance to repent and turn back. But again, if he repents and turns back to the Lord, somebody else would have had to take his place. We're not going to pick Ashley to betray Jesus. We're just going to pick Abigail to protect.
The man hangs himself afterwards.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means. It's like he chose this, and now because he realized that he was all part of the plan in crucifying Jesus.
Okay, first of all, Judas doesn't, he realizes that he's a part of a plan of the Pharisees' plan, but remember, he doesn't recognize that he's part of God's plan. And that's the thing that messes us up, is that, God, in essence, uses his own sinful action, his own sinful ways to accomplish his purpose. God didn't he didn't pull the trigger for Judas. He didn't make him do it. He uses his own sinful action and sinful choices to accomplish his purpose.
So could he have repented after the fact?
Could he have repented
I
after
don't know,
that?
the action of him hanging himself, it's not necessarily a repentant action, but it's definitely a guilty and shameful action.
Right. But the problem was he didn't know what to do with his guilt.
He sat there listening to Jesus the whole time.
And he doesn't know it. He heard the story of two, just like we talked about yesterday. He heard the story of two debtors and how one had owed much and one owed little, and yet the guy who was lending the money forgave all. He heard stories like that all 3 years, and yet he still doesn't know. It's Adam and Eve all over again. What are they doing? What are they doing instead of running back to God? Adam's hiding behind the tree and hiding behind the bushes when God is the only one he could go to, and yet he runs and hides. It's the same thing Judas is doing. Instead of turning to Christ, he tries to resolve his guilt by throwing the money. Is that going to be enough? No. Buying a field, he didn't buy the field, but buying of the field, no, that's not enough. Hanging himself, that's not enough, right? He tries to resolve the guilt in his way, making himself like his own judge, jury, and executioner. Could he have repented? Yeah, but does he repent? No, because the feeling of guilt and the actual act of repentance is not the same thing. Some people come to an altar, they cry, they snort, they snot because they're guilty, not because they've repented. They feel guilt. They got caught and they feel guilty, but that doesn't mean they repented. To repent is to turn from that which you are guilty from and turn to Christ. Make sense? There's not the same thing. Yeah, I'll agree with you that he could have repented and he did feel guilt, but his feelings of guilt did not lead him back to Christ. His feelings of guilt led him to a noose, to hang himself. We talked about the whole Caesar's friend thing, so I guess we'll just go ahead. Where are we at now that I got through preaching? It's a minute till, so yeah, we're good there. We're good there. Questions, comments, anything else? Does that make sense though? Does that? All right. We'll pick it up Wednesday.
Goodbye to your life. Subscribe and comment.
I'm gonna try
Leave
to
the
make
tithes and
coffee.
the offerings under there.
We'll leave the tithes and the offering.